Hello, everyone. It's Joe Rapp here again. Today is October 18th, 2021, and this is the Rap Report. Now, in today's episode, I'm going to be exploring the question, are we entering a new world war? And that question might seem extreme to some people, or to other people, it might not seem too extreme based on where the world is today. But I think it's a really important question to ask, and it's a really important question to explore because as you'll see as we go through the slides that I prepared today, as we start looking at the actual data, unfortunately, it does look like we are entering some type of global conflict again. And I believe that's why we are seeing what we're seeing in the world today. A lot of what we've experienced over the last 10 years from the economic policies from governments and also the consolidation of power and more authoritative governments and authoritarianism, right? Um, it all can be explained, and I think by looking at the data, by looking at the information, by looking at the facts, and thinking about things objectively, they help paint a clear picture about what's happening today, what's happened in the past, and we can make some type of prediction about what might be coming in the future and what's to come. These are really important topics. As I discussed in my last episode, we know for a fact inflation is here to stay. We've known that inflation has been here before the announcement of the Fed last month, but the information that we're going to be talking about today might help you have a better understanding about what's actually happening in society today, and that should clear up some of your confusion. So hopefully, you don't get caught up in too much of the propaganda that you're seeing on television news stations and a lot of misinformation about what's going on. The goal of everything that I'm doing here, the goal of these videos is to document history in real time, but also to help teach my audience a little bit more about what I believe is happening from an economic level, policy level, a political level. And what I hope that does is it helps educate others, because if you're more educated on what's actually going on right now, you'll understand it better, and you can properly plan for the future. But at the end of the day, like, it comes down to loving one another, honestly. But let's get through these slides, though. Let's get into it. I don't want to spend too much time with the intro here. I am going to be presenting slides, so bear with me. Hopefully it's not too much like a college lecture for you. But I think seeing these graphics and seeing the information in a slide form is going to make the most sense for this video. And yeah, so let's do it, y'all. Let's get into it. Are we entering a new world war? All right, so are we entering a new world war? What's going on around the world, Joe? What is actually happening here? What am I seeing from a political level? What am I seeing from the monetary economic side of things? What am I seeing from the social divide that's happening right now? We all see all this chaos. We know it's been going on for a long time, but what's the explanation of it? And that's a question that I think that enough people are not asking. Is we're getting way too caught up on the noise and the information about, hate your neighbor, hate this person, hate the person for not getting the jab, hate the person that's of this race or ethnicity. And we need to stop asking those questions. We need to start asking, why is this happening? Because when we start asking why is this happening, we start to actually understand it from a higher level context, and we can start making more rational decisions, and quite honestly start targeting the individuals that could be causing all of the mayhem today. All right, so let's get into it, though. So to answer the question if we're entering World War today, we have to take a step back and look at past conflicts, past world wars, and understand why they started, right? Why did they occur? Because if we understand why they occurred in the past, we could look at where we are in today in history, and then that could help lead to an answer to that question if we think we're heading into another global conflict of some sort. But what I want to do is I want to first start by exploring World War II. All right, so I want to explore the question of what really led to World War II. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people don't really understand why World War II happened or what caused World War II. It was such a horrific war, World War I and World War II. But World War II is an extremely horrific war. There's people that did, unimaginable things to other human beings. And there's people that changed from the beginning of the war. They were one person. And then, leading up to the war, they started to become very rational. They were changing. And then during the war, they were a whole different person. So, why did World War II happen, though? What led up to World War II? Well, the first thing that we have to talk about is World War I. So we have to take a step back. So World War I, the years of World War I, it happened between 1914 and 1918. This was a global war. At that time, the United States was a late entrant into the war, but we supplied a lot of the world with weapons, ammo, and all of the military machinery that they would need to go fight in the war. The United States during this time actually accumulated a lot of its gold reserves. So, in return for for us giving other countries weapons, ammo, munitions, trucks, tanks, all these war machinery, they gave us gold because the world at that time was on a gold standard, right? So we accumulated a lot of gold. World War I popped off. The world was at war, and then the war ended, right? Germany at that time was a part of the powers that had started World War One, but the blame at the end of World War One was on Germany. And what was signed after World War One is a document called the Treaty of Versailles. And I know my little image here is going to block off some of this text, but I'm just going to give you a quick little definition. What is the Treaty of Versailles? So Treaty of Versailles, here we can read the definition straight from Wikipedia. Of course, I didn't put that down, but you got the source, so don't get on me there. But the Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all of the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Right? So the Treaty of Versailles was a document that was signed after World War I. It was a treaty that was signed. And what it basically did is it basically blamed the Germans on World War I, blamed them for all of the destruction that happened around the world, all the consequences that were happening because of the war. And what we had essentially done is what the document did is it forced the Germans to pay retribution. So pay money to all of the surrounding countries in the world. So because Germany is the one that started World War I, we blamed them after the fact, and we made them pay to help rebuild Europe and most of the world for the destruction that had been done. Okay, this was right after World War I. So this is 1918 going on from 1918. So Germany at that time was on the line. They had to pay for all the damages that happened all around the world. All right, so that's after World War I. So that's from 1918. Well, leading up now, 1918 into the 1920s, Germany at that time was already very fragile, right? They had no more military might. The people were totally depressed and down. There was poverty. They didn't have much money, and the rest of the world looked at them pretty much basically as they were very upset at them, right? So they weren't very nice to the Germans. Now, let's fast forward though. So this is going through the 1920s. Germany's already starting to get all the backlash, right? 1929 stock market crash happens in the United States. Now, a lot of people might think that when you hear the great stock market crash, 1929 crash, some people think that it was just in the United States that this occurred. But you have to remember is after World War I, the U.S. and Britain, the U.S. was really gaining its military might as a world power, and the world was really tied to our financial system at that time. So when the 1929 stock market crash happened, it threw the world into a global depression. So it wasn't just the United States that was in a depression, it was the rest of the world. Okay, so crash happens, 1929. Economically here in the United States, it's bad, it's horrible, it's the worst it's ever been. But abroad, it's even worse. Okay, now after the 29 crash that led to the Great Depression, which we all know about, went from the years 1929 to 1939. Great Depression was here in the United States, but again, it was also abroad. And a lot of foreign countries had worse depressionary economic conditions than the United States because their currencies were all tied, back to the United States. So if the U.S. did bad, other countries did even worse. And to make that even worse, what the United States had actually started doing was recalling its gold and debts that it had provided out to other countries around the world. So now, with that being said, how does that tie back to Germany now? So the German people since 1918, 1919, 1920, 1918 is when it started, when they had to pay everyone back. They had their debt obligations. The people from 1918 all the way up until 1929, 1930 had gone through about 10 years of hard times. The inflation, the money wasn't doing well. They're socially they weren't doing well. Mentally they weren't doing well. They were very angry, right? And what happens after the Great Depression, though, is hyperinflation starts to ensue in Germany. So if you don't know what inflation is, I recommend you go back and you watch the, I believe the October 14th video of the Rap Report, where I talk a little bit more about inflation. But essentially what happened in Germany is, once the U.S. markets crashed in the 1929 crash, we had called back a lot of our foreign debt in gold. And what this did is it just absolutely demolished the German currency. So Germany, as it was, they had a lot of debt because they were paying back all of these other countries around the world from the World War I, and their debts were already sky high. And the Great Depression led them into hyperinflation. So basically what hyperinflation is you have so much currency that is circulating in an economy, and when the government decides to add more money to that overall supply of circulating money, what it does is it devalues everyone else's money. I gave the basic example, the pie example, in my last video. Imagine if you had a pie and you cut it into 10 slices, right? And you had 10 of your friends sitting around that pie. Each of you get 1/10 of a slice of pie. But, let's just say that the baker comes and he says, no, I messed up. Put all your slices of that pie back into that, the pie sheet. And then he decides he's going to cut a couple more slices of that pie. You no longer have your 1/10. Now you might have 1/116th or 1/118th of a slice. So your slice of that overall pie is less. That's what inflation is. When there's more money created into the overall supply of money. And in today's world, in 2021, this is known as quantitative easing. We see this in the stimulus packages, the stimmy bills. Anytime that happens, it devalues all of the existing money. It's a hidden tax. So, all the money you have in your bank account, once these stimulus packages are passed, your money is actually worth less. So you used to be able to buy, with your money in your bank account, one year you used to be able to buy, 5 cars. The next year, because of inflation, you could really only buy 4 cars with that money. It's the same amount of money, but it buys you less things. That's because of the value decreasing. So this chart you can see here on your right, your left. I'm not sure exactly where you're going to be seeing it, which side of the screen that is. But this is a chart showing the German mark hyperinflation. So you'll see the x-axis starts in 1918, and then it goes all the way until 1923. And then on the y-axis on the bottom, you could see that there was it's a dollar, like essentially a 1-to-1 value of gold traded in for the German mark, which was the Germany currency at the time in the early 20s. And you see though, once we get up to 1922, 1923, they start going through hyperinflation, right? So they start going through hyperinflation. Their money is now becoming worth less and less. So their debts are very high. They're indebted to the world because of World War I, and their money becomes worthless. And this image that you see here they're quite popular. A lot of these images of hyperinflation in Germany showing, kids stacking money on towers and, the money being worth nothing, like people walking along in wheelbarrows. That's what it was like. But for these people, their lives were horrible. They had no jobs. They had no money. This has been going on for 10, 15 years. Can you imagine the day-to-day struggle of having to deal with that? Now, what does that do to people, though? It changes people. So what happened going into the 30s? Going into the 30s, we started to have the rise of what's called populism. So populism in politics, so this is in the political scene, a populist candidate comes about, typically, in times where society is really struggling. The people are really hurting. They have nothing else to look forward to. But a very strong leader comes up and promises change. And because of the strength that leader shows, and because of the change that they promise, and because the people are struggling and hurting, and they're just mentally drained, they want change. And they start voting for these populist presidents who are very extreme, who may not ever get elected in a normal type of society where things are good, the economy's good. These people probably wouldn't be elected in these periods. But we see populism at the time where society is really struggling. And that's what happened in the 20s going into the 30s. Here you see a picture of Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. These are populist candidates. These were populist politicians that rose to power in the 20s and 30s after the Great Depression, as the world was really struggling economically. The people were changing, and they started voting for these extreme right or left-leaning candidates. So that's a basic story of how World War II started. World War II essentially started because, the United States, through the Roaring 20s, spent a lot of money. Credit was extended way far. we did things that we shouldn't have done in our banking industry, and we blew up the world's stock markets, right? We blew up the 1929 crash in the United States, totally threw the rest of the world into a depression. Because the rest of the world went into depression, the people all around the world in these countries really started struggling and hurting. Because those people were struggling and hurting, they started voting for these populist candidates on each extreme side. Hitler, Stalin, Hitler being a right-wing fascist, a nationalist. Stalin being a communist, a left-wing communist. Mussolini being, they say Mussolini switched between socialism and communism, but eventually it all led back to fascism, though. And what is fascism? Fascism is the combination of a government and government and private sector businesses, but to all come back up to one leading dictator or power control, whether that's the government or a political dictator or anything like that. But it's the combination of the government and the companies in that country. Whereas communism is more of a political party, the Communist Party, the government party dictates what businesses exist, how many goods are made in what area, right? That's kind of communism. Socialism is more where the best way I explain it is, socialism would be, again, kind of like communism, where there's a socialist party up at top that controls the way that that country's economy functions. But the difference is that they spread out the goods among everyone. So say you have two farmers that are next to each other, and one farmer is producing more cattle than another farmer. The government has the right to come into that farmer that's producing more cattle and take some of his cattle away and then disperse that off to other farmers, because it's equal across all bounds, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing. But now that we know how World War II really started, the question is, can it happen again? That's the main question. Can it happen again? And this first part brings us into 1971. So let's fast forward now. The World War II ended in 1945. The United States came out as the world leader. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, it was determined by all the political leaders around the world that the United States was the superpower. The dollar was going to be the reserve currency of the world, and it was going to be backed by gold. And that's the important part, is that the dollar used to be backed by gold. We used to operate on a gold standard. And the importance of that is when gold was money, and gold has been money for thousands of years in history, but when gold was money, there was only so much gold that could exist at one time all around the world. The only way that you can create more gold is if you dig it out of the ground physically, right? So what that does is it prevents governments from creating too much of it. Governments can't create more gold. They have to go out, they have to dig more gold out of the ground, or they have to go out and take over a country and steal their gold. But they can't actually create more of that money. They can't create more of the gold, okay? But in 1971, there was an incident called the Nixon Shock. So President Nixon in the United States took the U.S. dollar off of the gold standard. So he broke it away, the dollar from the gold standard. This was arguably, and it was a default of national debt. So the U.S. essentially was defaulting on all the debt they had. We were over creating money. We were creating more dollar bills than we had gold reserves to back those dollar bills. We were in debt from Vietnam and after, post World War II. And instead of telling the world, hey, you know what, we messed up and we went broke and we defaulted on our debt, Nixon decided to take us off the gold standard. And that's when this fiat money standard started. So fiat money means, money by government decree. So paper money. So after 1971, the dollars that you see right now, the dollars that are all around the world, were no longer backed by gold. They were just only backed by the government and the government's credit, essentially. And this is important because once 1971 started, we started existing on this new form of money where governments could create more of it at will. And based on how much of it they're creating is what the value of that money is. And you'll see in this chart here, this shows the compensation rates of society. So this is worker compensation. This is your salaries, your pay for working. And you can see in 1948, so on the x-axis shows the year, 1948, 1972, 2017. You can see here, and then on the y-axis, it's productivity. So what this will tell you is based on how productive you are, based on how much you work, how much you're spending, how much time at the factory you're working, how many hours you're putting in, how much you're actually being compensated for that work. And you could see that the yellow line represents productivity, the red line represents compensation or pay. Well, you can see up until 1971, compensation and productivity were aligned. So if you were working long hours at the factory, if you were working more hours at the office, you were getting paid for that, your worth. But after 1971, once Nixon broke us off the gold standard, what happened is we had this fork in productivity and compensation. And that's because the money, our money, changed from being backed by gold, backed by a government-resistant ability to devalue the currency through inflation, to now, after 1971, the government can start creating more of the money supply and they can start devaluing all of our savings. And that's exactly what happened in 1971. And you can see here that even though people's productivities went up until 2017, people have been working more hours, spending more time in the office, we have not been getting paid our fair share for that productivity because of the currency, because the money is broken. It is no longer backed by anything fixed. And that's what you see here. And this is an ongoing problem. This is why we hear about our grandparents being able to afford, a home in their 30s and 40s, and they could send their kids to college after working, an entire career. And I'm referring to our grandparents who were, alive through World War II, after World War II. It was really because their savings was worth something. Up until 1971, it was backed by gold. So every year their savings was worth more and more and more than it was the year prior. Now, since 1971, your savings is worth less and less and less and less and less every year because of inflation, because of the money. It's no longer backed by gold. It's no longer backed by anything fixed or scarce. And that's the reality. In today's world, in 2021, if you have been trying to save money in a bank account, like you should be, because that's the most, you would think common sense wise says we save, we work hard, we save, but you've been losing. You've really been losing. And it's because of inflation. And it's because the money is different than it used to be. But that was a Nixon shock, 1971. That was the start of this time period where, society started changing again. And what has happened since 1971? We've had, major crashes through we had some crashes through the 80s and 90s, the dot-com bubble crash. But we also had the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. That was a major crash. Arguably, that is what started to cause a lot of the wealth inequality that we see in the world today. Last year, 2020, massive sell-off in stocks, big market crashes. 2021, the same thing. We're starting to have massive inflation, and that's something I showed in my prior video with the money creation. Lots of inflation. Your savings are being devalued faster than they've ever been devalued, and this is leading to wealth inequality, okay? So, we're starting to see signs again of society getting back into this monetary issue where the money is starting to become worth less and less and less. And because the money isn't worth anything anymore, people are struggling. People have not been able to save for homes. People have not been paid for their work. We just looked at the productivity chart. People are going years and years and years of struggling, going paycheck to paycheck, and they're changing. That was the big deal with last year with the 2020 incident. And what we're seeing now in 2021 is it completely obliterated the middle class. All the lockdowns completely took out all of the small businesses, took out all of the mom and pop shops. Everyone had to use their savings. The money, because of all the stimulus packages that were being created, it's devaluing everyone else's savings. So the point is that today in 2021, people around the world are in the same kind of economic situations as they were in the 1920s and 30s. This is another chart that just shows the amount of inflation that has existed in the dollar. So what this chart is pretty much showing is the purchasing power of a dollar from the year 1913 all the way up until 2013. And this is what inflation has done. This is what I mean by purchasing power, of devaluing your money. So it's a hidden thing. It's really hidden. A lot of people don't understand it. But as more inflation is created, it takes away the amount of stuff you can purchase. And I like to bring up the example again of our grandparents, our great-grandparents that were alive in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? They used to be able to buy a house for $20,000, right? They used to be able to buy, a car for $200, whatever it was, a couple $100. Whereas today, a house will cost you $400,000, $500,000. The car will cost you $50,000, $60,000. A lot of people hear about, they know those stories, and we always talk about, oh, your money was worth something. But why, though? It's because of inflation. If there was no inflation, we would still be paying the same amount for the goods and services as they did back then. So here you can see, dollar was created in 1913, and $1 bought you the equivalent of whatever $1 was at that time, right? But then you can see as time goes on, what you can buy with $1 starts lowering. So in 1933, you see here, after FDR made it illegal for Americans to hold gold, $1 no longer bought you the same as $1 back in 1913. $1 now bought you the equivalent of 75 cents of a dollar. Fast forward, 1971, when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, $1 in 1971 only got you about 28 cents, 25 cents of what $1 used to buy you in 1913. And you come all the way to the right here, and you see this chart ends in 2013. But $1 in 2013 buys you 5 cents of what it did back in 1913. So this is just more of a visual representation of, the dollar eroding through its history as inflation sets in, as governments spend more money. And this explains why it's very hard for people to live in today's world, because their money isn't worth as much as it used to be worth. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and move on, right? So let's switch this up a little bit here. And I'm going to move my little icon for this one chart just so I can change that up there. There we go. That's a little better. All right. So this is a chart these are two charts that I actually showed in my last video, right? So we know that the dollar's going through inflation. We know that, the money isn't working. But with this chart, what I really want to prove is how the system today is broken, how the economy is broken, and explain who's benefiting the most from this wealth creation. Who's getting wealthy today in this inflationary period. The top chart right here is the M2 money supply chart. So this shows you how much money, how many dollar bills are being created by the U.S. Treasury, or the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed, right? The Fed. So it's important again to understand, I know I've said this a lot in the past, but the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank, is not a government entity. The name Federal Reserve Bank, they put that name in there to make it sound like it was connected to the federal government, but it's not. Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed, is a private bank that is the only bank that can create the money supply for the U.S. government. And that's the same thing with any country around the world. The central bank in those countries are private banks that lend to the governments and create more of that money in governments. So essentially governments are in debt to the bank, okay? But the point being here is you can see on this top chart, the money supply. So from 1960 on the x-axis, it goes all the way until 2020. And you can see through the 70s, there was a little bit more money that's created. Going into the 90s, there's a little bit more money that's created. Inflation's, it's not that bad. It's not, it's not too crazy. There's not as much money supply. But once we hit the dot-com bubble in 2000 and the housing crisis, you start to see a really large increase in that curve in the money supply growth. And then we get to the end here, 2020, last year, and then going into 2021, it starts going parabolic. It starts going like a hockey stick curve. So what this is showing is that right now, we are having more money that's ever been created. And that curve is going from a steady curve to now it's starting to go hyperbolic. It's starting to go a hockey stick, vertical. That's not a good sign. Again, I'm going to come back here to show you what the German mark did, Weimar Republic. You see that curve for their inflation? They started to get that hockey curve. Once that starts, it's a compounding effect. It's just because there's so much money that's created. The more you have to create devalues all the existing money so much that it goes parabolic. And the only way that ends is if the currency collapses. So here we are now in 2021, and we're starting to see just the start of that hockey curve happening. The bottom chart here is the velocity of money. So what this is representing is how much money that's existing in the economy is actually circulating throughout the economy. How much of it is being spent at stores, how much of it is changing hands. And typically a higher velocity ratio represents a better functioning economy, right? More people are spending, more people are saving. It's a more functional economy. But when there's a low velocity of money, what that means is that there's less money that's being spent, right? There's less money that's moving through the hands. There's less spending happening at grocery stores or at restaurants. And what we can see is in the year 2000, between the years 2010 and 20, on the top chart, which is the money supply, the growth in money, the inflation of money, we have the more inflation that's ever existed ever in history of the United States. But we can see on the bottom chart is that the velocity of that money has dropped off. So what that means is that there's more money that's ever being created historically, but it's not moving and it's not going anywhere. No one's spending it. This shows you the velocity in 2021 is the lowest that it's been since the 1960s. And arguably, it hasn't been that low since the 1920s and 30s. So how does that make sense, though? How can we be creating more money ever? Because that's what's justifying. You listen to the pundits on TV and the politicians today, and you turn on your TV and you listen to Biden or any of these people, and they say, these multi-trillion-dollar stimulus bills are for you. They're for the people. We need to pass these to help you. We need to pass these for the social aid, for the people, the good of the people. But the truth is that the money that they're creating isn't going into the people's pockets. It's not even touching the people. It's not moving at all. So who's benefiting from that money? Who's benefiting from all of the money that's being created, all the stimulus packages that are being created? The rich. This is the issue that's going on right now, is that over 2020 and 21, and even before that, but I'm just painting a clear picture about the last 1.5 years specifically, because this is a big part of what's going on around the world today, is that 2021 lockdowns caused massive economic disruption, wiped out the middle class. Stores weren't allowed to be open because you had to wear masks, all this other stuff, right? But what stores were allowed to be open? Walmart, Amazon, Costco's, the big mom and pops, right? The big corporate stores, the Facebooks, the technology companies, they were allowed to be open. Well, what happened? There was a massive wealth transfer that occurred. You can see here, this is a nice little picture graph here. In the blue dots here, you can see all of these billionaires on top. So you got Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison. The blue dot represents their net worth in the year 2020, March 18th, 2020. The red dot represents their wealth at the end of 2020, December 2020 or 2020. So as you can see, throughout the year, billionaires got richer. The rich got richer by a lot. So now I want to bring us back to this chart. It paints a perfect example. All this money that's being created in the stimulus packages by the Federal Reserve, by the Treasury, as the politicians are telling us it's for us, it's for the people, we can see that the most money is ever being created, but it's not being moved. However, we know that the billionaires and the rich in the United States have gotten richer than they ever have. So what I believe is occurring is that this stimulus money that's being created now and all these packages are being handed down to the banks and the big companies. And those big companies and banks are not passing that down to Main Street Americans. They're not passing it down to you and I. It is going into their bank accounts. It's going and it's being held by them, and it's not moving. It's not circulating. And we can see that based off of these two charts. We can see that based off of the wealth data that we're seeing here. This is where we are. So this is where the wealth gap is. This is what's going on with the stimulus money, all the inflation today. Okay. Now, it's also important to say that it is not the fault of these people. This is a systemic problem. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, they're not, and many of these business owners are not really viciously, purposely trying to steal all the wealth, although some of them know what they're doing. But it's a systemic issue, right? It's the fact that we're operating off of a form of money that's broken, that provides the ability for other government officials to dictate how much of it is created. And because of the way the debt-based system is working now, the people at the top, the billionaires, the elites, the government officials get first access to the money, and it never makes it down to Main Street Americans. Now, I want to explain, why that's important and why that's significant, and how this rate relates back to the early 1920s and 30s. So what this chart here is showing you is the y-axis, or the x-axis is, again, years. So it's from the year 1900 all the way until the year 2020. And the y-axis here shows you U.S. wealth. So all of the money that exists in the United States, what percentage of that wealth is being held by either the blue line, which represents the bottom 90% of Americans, or the red line, which is the top 0.1% of Americans. So the red line represents the Bezoses, the Zuckerbergs, the top 0.1% of rich in the United States. And the blue line represents the rest of us, the bottom 90% of Americans. What we can see, if you look here in the year, leading up to 2020, is that the top 0.1%, the Bezoses, the Zuckerbergs, owned about 22%, 23% of U.S. wealth. But you can see that it touches the blue line. So what that means is that they own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. How fucking crooked is that, right? If you had a scale and you were weighing to see if it was balanced, it would go poof, and the rich, the billionaire class would burn. They would take all the wealth. So the top 0.1% owns the same amount of money as the bottom 90% of people. Think about that. That is such a wealth gap. That disparity is so large. But what do we also see right now, right? We can see it's circled here. We see emergence of populism again, right? We talked about populists leading up to World War II. But let's take a look back now. What happened in the 1920s into the 1930s? You can see right up leading up to World War II, by the numbers in the charts, the same wealth gap existed back then. So for the first, what does this mean though? So what this means is in society, for the first time since just before World War II, the wealth gap is as wide as it's ever been. There's only 2 times over the last, 100 so years where the wealth gap has been so bad, where the rich have owned the same amount as the rest of the 90%. And it's happening now. And the last time it happened was right before World War II. What does this mean, though? What does this explain? This explains why we're seeing what we're seeing in the world today with politicians. This explains why we're seeing what we're seeing with protests. From 2010 on, every protest that's occurred around the world, the major ones in many of the countries have all been around the same issues: wealth inequality, taxation, and the fight between the haves and have-nots. It started with Occupy Wall Street. It went to the Arab Spring. It went to the Gilets Jaunes movement in France. Went all the way to Hong Kong. These are all around the world. We're seeing the same issues, and it is because of the wealth gap. It's because society right now, everyone is hurting socially. Pay is bad. Your money's not worth anything. Life is just dragging and it's sucking, just like it did leading up to World War II. Now, what does that mean, right? You can see here populist presidents in the 20s and 30s and 40s. It was Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, right? These are all examples. There was many other populist presidents all around the world during that time. It's because the people were struggling, they were hurting, and they were voting for the extreme right or lefts. Now, the only other time in history we've seen populism is right now, the same time. It's happening again because people are hurting and they're struggling, and they're going to vote for the extreme right or left politicians. That's why we're seeing this happen again. And this is leading, once again, to the rise of populism. Now, I just gave 3 images here of 3 examples of populists. There's populist presidents and politicians all around the world today. You can just do your own Google search. I just did this just for conversation's sake. Donald Trump, populist, right? The Make America Great movement and the Midwest Belt movement, and him trying to rally the steelworkers, a lot of the blue-collar Americans, is because those individuals that work those jobs used to be worth something in the United States when the U.S. was really efficient at those industries. But over the last 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of that work's been outsourced. A lot of that cost to actually produce those goods and to dig that oil out of the ground and to make the steel isn't cost effective in the United States anymore. It's been moved out. But this is a whole class of people that are being affected by that, and they're hurting and they're struggling. And it's not their faults. Again, it's too many people right now are getting really emotional about this. It's all politics and it's all this and that. No, it's not. Ask why it's happening. And if you ask, why is this happening? Why are these people doing this? And it's happening on not just the right side of the political spectrum, the left side too. Why are these people struggling? Why are they making these decisions? It's because financially they're struggling. It's because their jobs are gone. It's because they're hurting. There's no pay. The money's not worth anything. And they're going to choose an authoritarian, strong, extremely extreme president on the right side or the left side. Right side, we've seen Donald Trump. We see Boris Johnson, right? But on the left side, we see the Elizabeth Warrens and the AOCs and the Tlaibs. This is what we're seeing. So it is happening again. It is happening again. And the numbers are telling us that it's happening again. And this explains more of the story of what's happening today. The important thing this time around, though, is that monetary policy will no longer work. So this is a very big issue. So, we talked about, why society is where it is. We talked about the money and the problem with the money. The problem with the dollar and the problem with currencies around the world is that the system, the monetary policy, the monetary system, the whole banking industry, the money supply, that system is no longer working. You can see here, this is a chart that just shows the short-term interest rate, U.S. interest rates. So why is this important? The Federal Reserve sets an interest rate where all other interest rates are set off of. So the Fed will say, okay, the federal funds rate is 3%, for example. Right now, it's not even there. It's less than I believe it's around 1%. But let's just say 3%. So now all the banks that give out like car loans and home mortgages and personal loans, they will modify their loan structures off of that Fed fund rate. So the Federal Reserve interest rate that they set dictates on what the banks will give out for interest rates to companies and people and stuff like that. And you can see in the 70s, we had high interest rates because inflation was going up. A lot of money was being created. But the Fed raised the interest rates, so it prevented banks from borrowing money and companies from borrowing money. And what that was able to do is it was able to kind of slow down how much spending was happening with people and slow down the inflation a little bit. But you can see here in 2010 on, interest rates are at or near zero, just as they were in the 1930s going to the 40s. So the problem with the 1920s, 30s, and 40s before World War II is that governments monetary policy no longer worked. Governments were in debt. They were going through hyperinflation, and there was no way for them to change that because the monetary policy, the tools that they had, and the ability to morph and mold the banking industry to make it work and to weather the storm for people was no longer existent. Same thing is happening now. Okay? Same thing is happening now. Interest rates right now are at or near zero. National debt, U.S. national debt, is at all-time highs. And again, you can see all the way down here, this is 1970 when Nixon took us off the gold standard, and you can see the massive hockey stick increase that has happened in U.S. national debt since then. And this is because the money changed from being backed by gold, being backed by a form of money where governments couldn't create more of it because they couldn't dig more gold out of the ground, right? Countries couldn't go to war because you had to fund your war, but if you didn't have enough gold, you couldn't go to war. And they were kept on. And the good thing about the gold standard is it kept the checks and balances on governments. So governments couldn't do all this unnecessary spending. They couldn't do things that weren't going to be good for the country because they couldn't create more of the money. But ever since Nixon took us off the gold standard, that didn't exist anymore. Now governments can create as much money as they want at will. And we can see that as time goes on, unfortunately, the amount of money that's being created is compounding. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're getting in more debt. And now we're past, $23, $24 trillion in national debt. This is not sustainable. This is a devaluation of money, and it's a crack up and boom. We are watching the erosion in the end of the dollar. That is something that I've been talking about for the last 4 years. And this is painting that picture, and it's showing it through the numbers, through the data. But let's go on. So what does that mean, though? So what does that mean? Okay, Joe, you told me everything about the dollar. Talk to me about inflation. Where do we go from here when the dollar ends? Well, the fact is that we move on to a new form of money. We move on to a new system. Believe it or not, we like to, because us Americans have been living for, I'm 29 years old. So for my 29 years on Earth, the dollar is the only thing I've known. So, of course the dollar is the reserve currency. It must have always been the reserve currency. No, that is not the case. Reserve currencies change every 100 or 120 years or so. So reserve currencies will change with whoever that superpower is during that 100-year period. And world powers have been changing throughout history. And it's weird. It's like every 100 years or so, there is a new world power that comes up. There's a war that's fought, and then whoever wins that war sets the monetary policy, and they set their currency. The United States won World War II, 1944. The U.S. dollar became the reserve currency of the world. We set the banking standards, and we've had that since 1944. Now that's changing. We're going through this period in the cycle where the reserve currency status is changing, and that explains why we're seeing the dollar erode and we're seeing the end of the dollar. And you can see here, again, the x-axis is years, the y-axis is the country that had that reserve currency throughout that year. So Portugal had the reserve currency from just after the 1400s to before, around the 1500s. Spain was the next country that had it for about 100 years. The Netherlands after them, France, Britain was before the United States because Britain was a world power in going into the 1900s, and then the U.S. from 1944 on until now had reserve currency status, but that's changing. So what's next, though, right? Who is this? Who is going to take over from the U.S. as a superpower next, and who could be putting a reserve currency of some sort in power? And I believe that's China. A lot of what we've been seeing on U.S. news has been, targeting the Russians and all this other stuff. And I think there's a larger story that needs to be told there. And it's really China ultimately. So let's talk about China. So, and I'm going to move my little icon back over here. Maybe that'll be a little better. Let's see. All right. So and I'm cutting it off a little bit here, but there's a saying, currency wars lead to trade wars, lead to hot wars. Currency wars lead to trade wars, lead to hot wars. What part of that sounds familiar to a lot of you? Probably the trade war stuff, right? We've been hearing about trade wars with China, Donald Trump, but what people don't really know is that there was a currency war and there is currency wars that are going on with China, and there was a currency war before the trade war, and then once because why? What currency war existed with China? Well, what was happening is that China was creating more of their money. They were purposely or not purposely, but China essentially was creating more of their money supply, devaluing their currency, making it cheaper on purpose so that people would buy more goods and services from China because it's cheaper products. Well, that means that China now has the ability to attract a lot of customers around the world. Chinese goods are cheap. The U.S. didn't like that because the U.S. doesn't want currency manipulation because they're the world power and they're the only ones that can manipulate their currency, right? They're only in their system. So that led to tariffs, and that led to trade wars. The tariffs that were imposed in China imposed tariffs on U.S. goods. So a tariff is, you have to pay a fee for imports. Anytime a Chinese good comes into the U.S., there needs to be a fee that's paid on that back to China. Same thing. Anytime Chinese buy U.S. products, there's a fee that the Chinese have to pay the United States. So that leads to trade wars. That's a trade war. And then next is hot wars. This is a saying. This always ends up happening throughout history. All right. So let's take a look at this example of 4 countries that had reserve currencies and what their lifeline was like. And these slides come from Ray Dalio down Bridgewater Associates. This is from his book, Big Debt Crisis. I really recommend everyone looks it up online. You can get a free PDF download. Just Google search Big Debt Crisis, and you can put in your email address, subscribe, and he'll send you the book for free on PDF. But all of these different lines here on each of these countries represent different things. So the blue one is tech, education, computers. The red one's output, so how much goods they're creating, how much products they're creating, how much output they're creating. The green one is trade. The light blue one is their military power. The black one is their financial power. So how much of a financial hub are they? Because you're in today's world, while the American empire was around, Wall Street was the financial empire, right? So where was the finance? And then the gold one is the reserve status. So that's the actual reserve currency. And you can see here, the Dutch, this was while they were an empire, they were considered the world superpower, the year 1500 all the way. Their decline happened in the 1900s. But you can see that they were really peak going into the 1700s. So this says that all of their tech, all their education, the money, everything was at its peak. It was at the top. But then as time went on, entropy sets in and everything starts to decline, right? So that happened there first, right? And then After the Dutch, who came into power? Britain. Britain became a superpower, world power. And you can see from the 1700s going until about the mid 1800s, Britain was at the top. They were peak empire of the world. They were the power. And then entropy sets in. And entropy, when I say that, I mean the breakdown of stuff. Entropy is like the breakdown. Everything they say in the physical world has entropy. So everything will decay and break down at some point. So it happened to Great Britain. Now let's go to the United States. Our peak empire was in 1950, around 1950. So after World War II, we were the world superpower, 1950, right? Now let's look at China, though. And you can see in the United States over the last 20 to 30 years, starting entropy setting in, we're starting to decline, right? Now let's go back and let's look at China, though, right? China's next. You can see from 2000 on, all of their lines are starting to increase. Their technology is getting better. Their military is getting better. Their trade's getting better. Their finances are getting better. Now, so this is painting the picture. So if you look at all of this objectively, this is showing us that, China is becoming the world superpower. Now, this chart represents, out of all of those countries, out of all the superpowers that have existed, this shows how fast and what industries will typically fall apart first. So this is an average across all the empires that have been around for the last, close to 1,000 years. And this 0 year right here represents the peak of all those empires. So it doesn't matter what year it was. It was just when they were peak, they were the top of the top. And then this shows you negative 35, so 35 years before their peak, and then 70 years before their peak, and then 105 years before their peak, 140 years before their peak. The positive side shows you positive 35 years. So 35 years after the peak of that empire, 70 years after the peak of the empire, 105 years after the peak of the empire. So you can see when they're at peak, when countries are at peak empire, everything's at the top, right? But then you see as years go by, 35 years go by, entropy sets in. There's starting to be a decline. 70 years go by, technology starts going down, education starts going down. They're not producing as much as a country anymore. Output goes down. The military power starts to go down. Their financials go down. But the important thing to look at here is the reserve currency, the reserve status. The reserve currency is always the last thing to fail for an empire. It's always the last. It has been shown to be always the last. And if you look at the curve, it doesn't just slowly end like the other industries. It crashes. It's very vertical. This is what we're seeing right now. This is what I believe we're seeing. I believe we're seeing, for the United States, we've started to see all of our industries starting to decline. Our reserve status right here, the gold bar, is still up. But if you look at the last thing to fall, it's always the reserve status. And based on the prior slides that I've showed you of the dollar, where the dollar stands right now, I believe that we're watching, and I say this as an American, I say this as a veteran, I say this as someone who supports freedom, liberties, everything that the American dream of liberties and stuff. I know a lot of that, there's noise and there's all of the bad stuff that has happened, but the true fundamental values as people, I believe in very, very deeply. But the fact is you got to look at the truth here, and we are looking, I believe, at the end of this empire, and we're watching the end of the reserve status, the end of the currency falling apart. Now, this is just one more chart. Shows the this shows the overall who's in power at any given time. So we could see here the blue line represents the United States, the red line represents China, and again the x-axis is the year. So year 1500 all the way until the year 2000. So China has been a superpower in the past, many times before throughout history, throughout the last 1,000+ years, and we know that their empire has gone on for thousands of years. The Chinese empire has been there, so it's nothing new that they're now they're coming to light again as a new world empire. But we can see that the U.S. is declining as China is rising. Okay, and I want this to be clear: is that sometimes we become very nationalist and we have a lot of pride in where we're from, and I support that. But you can't be a superpower forever, and that's just the facts. And these countries do change hands and superpowers. And again, it looks like it is the Chinese way for the 21st century. More data showing this. So this shows you GDP, gross domestic product. So this is how much output a country actually makes in goods and services and everything. How much the country, how healthy they are financially. So how much their economy is working, how much goods they're creating, what's their health of their economy. And you can see the blue line represents the U.S., the red line China, and China surpassed us in GDP just after 2010. And the projections you can see is that they're going to be producing more than the United States in years to come. Same thing happens with right here, the bottom left chart, share of global exports. China has more exports. They export more products than the U.S. Output is predicted to be increasing more on China's side. Global equity market cap. So, this stands for like how much of the stocks, how much of the stock market and the companies that are in stock, the equity in that stock, where does it reside? Is it U.S. companies that people can buy stock in, or is it Chinese companies that people can buy stock in? Trending more towards China. And then the same thing with debt securities. And again, this does look like the 21st century will be the Chinese century. All right. Now, this also will help us tie into the question of, are we in a new world war? Are we entering a new world war? And what this shows us is all of the times that there's been a rising power competing against an existing power. So the rising power, China in this case, existing power, US. Each of these rows shows you that exact situation. So you can see the time frame right here on the first left-hand column. Who was the ruling power in place during that time period? Who was the rising power during that time period? So who was coming up in power? And was there a war or not? Because there's a term called the Fucidity Trap. And what that means is that when there's a rising power coming up against an existing world power, there's this tendency for conflict to arise and war to happen. Because the existing power does not want to give up power to the rising power. But the rising power is naturally just doing things better, doing things more efficiently. And it just is what it is. And unfortunately, we can see this starts in the 16th century down to the 19th century. We come over here to the 20th century and we can see, early 20th century, Germany was the rising power against Russia, UK, France. This was the World War II period. And we can see that resulted in wars. Mid 20th century, there was a slight conflict that happened with Japan. But we can see, the fall of the Soviet Empire right here, the U.S. Empire, or the fall of the USSR. There was no war that happened there. The Berlin Wall came down. A lot of people remember that. And then most recently, again, with this one. So, we can see that as rising powers come up against world superpowers, existing powers, there's more of a tendency for war to break out than there's not. And in my opinion, that's, it's common sense. The world power doesn't want to give up their power. But will happen again. So, but what are we seeing now? So what is this relating to? It's the rise of communism and fascism in the 21st century. And again, if we go back to this chart here, we can understand that the same political situations that are happening today in 2021 are the same political situations that happened in the 1920s and 30s. They're happening because the wealth gap is just as bad as it was. And people are hurting. They're poor. They're struggling socially. So their minds are changing. They're getting irrational. And they're voting for extremist candidates on left and right. And in history, at least the last 150, 200 years, we've seen those extremes typically are fascism and communism. And that's what we're seeing again. So what's happening now? And I'm not going to go totally into this. This is just to explain one side. On one side of the political spectrum, we're seeing this shift towards fascism, but amongst global leaders. So, the Build Back Better campaign was put out by the World Economic Forum. The United States and a lot of politicians around the world over the last election cycle were using that as their campaign slogan, Build Back Better, and they still are today. This is a global effort of world powers and leaders coming together for one objective, which is communism. It is fascism. The goal of this is to create a new society and new rules that people will have to follow for whatever the reason being. But it is in a coalition, and it is a united effort. We're also seeing at the same time we're seeing the fight between the old power structures, so the World Economic Forums and the U.S. and all of the ally powers that existed, fighting against China. China's being as a communist government, but again, Thucydides trap, rising world power. So we're seeing the fight between China as well at the same time. But ultimately, what is this leading this to? It's leading to a new form of fascism and communism with an integration of technology. The apps that we're seeing, the medical health apps now that are being imposed on people in different countries, we know that these apps are, you're being told that it's going to just be for your medical records, but the truth is that it's being integrated and connected in the background with a social credit score. So all of your social media accounts, all of your Google searches, all of your online interactions feed back to databases now, primarily held by different companies or governments. And, I don't need to tell anyone here that, the government knows exactly what you're doing on social media. You should know that. But it's all being tied now, and it's giving you a social credit score. So, what is your score? How pro-government are you, or how anti-government are you? That's happening. It's happened in China. China's had their credit score out for several years now, but it's happening around the world. We're also seeing the introduction of central bank digital currencies, which you'll see up here on the top left chart. I've created a video on how the Federal Reserve Bank might roll out a central bank digital currency. I created that video last year, and this year the Federal Reserve has announced that they are looking to create a central bank digital currency. And so is China, and so is every other country around the world. So this is becoming a real thing. So your money will no longer be physical in the form of dollars. It will be in the form of a cryptocurrency that's created by the bank, though, by the Federal Reserve Bank. So we're seeing this new form, as people are struggling and they're hurting, we're seeing this new form of communism and fascism that's arising, that is imposing tight restrictions and controls on people in the name of medicine or for whatever the reason being. But the truth is there's tight restrictions and controls. There's a control of the money supply, but there's also broken money. These central bank digital currencies will not be anything good. I'm talking about, imagine if you had money that expired in a certain time frame, and you can only go and use that money at certain locations. And in China, if you are bad, or if you're a bad boy, or you speak out against certain individuals, maybe you don't even get any money, and they shut your money off completely, shut your passports off completely. So we're seeing this tight down control. We're seeing a restriction in speech. We're seeing a restriction in the narratives that people can talk about. This is what we're watching happen. And I believe it's happening because of where society is now. Again, that chart with populists. And also the fact that people are struggling. So they're willing to opt for these kind of things to occur. Because they're struggling, because they want change. And these authoritative leaders are promising change for them. But as we've seen with past conflicts, though, this change is never for the good of people. The only thing that has really proven in humanity so far to be good for people, at least during periods of prosperity, has been individual freedoms, free markets. So to allow the ability for competition to come in, not corruption, because again, in the U.S. system, people think that democracy has been in the United States. We have not had a democratic system for years. We've had a kleptocratic system. We have socialism for the corporations. So for the last 40 years, arguably since Nixon, there's a small group of people who have benefited in the United States over everyone else. That's the truth. That's what we've seen. So true free markets allow for prosperity, individual freedoms, wealth preservation, and not communism, not fascism, and not top-down control. But that's what we're seeing today. All right. So I want to leave it on this last point, though. How do you escape? Because there is the ability to escape from this. No matter what you're seeing happening in the world today, there is a life raft, and there is an ability to opt out of a system that's being created. And that is Bitcoin. And I talk about this quite a bit on this channel. I'm very passionate on this topic, and it is true. As society starts to become more chaotic, because this will continue, just as we saw leading up to World War II, things are going to get more chaotic. Things are going to get really confusing, more confusing than they are today. People are going to start acting more irrational than they have today. And the money system, the money that people own and hold, is going to become worth less and less and less and less, because we're going through an inflationary event and soon entering a hyperinflationary event. You can save in Bitcoin, and that will help you preserve all your wealth through this time period that we're going in. But the important thing is, as you're preserving your wealth, you're going to have more ability to be flexible and to do more than the average person might be able to do. If you're the average person and you're saving with your dollars in a bank account, and you're just only doing that, or you're buying stocks or anything, you're exposed to inflation. Your money is becoming worth less and less. I don't care if your stock made 200%. Your currency, the dollar, it's priced in dollars. Your dollar devalued at the same time 50%. So you really didn't make any money at all. It's all a mirage. You have to hold an alternative. During World War II, that alternative was gold, and governments tried to make it illegal for their citizens to hold gold. So that was a direct threat to people. But Bitcoin, because there's a fixed supply, 21 million whole units, and you can break down one unit of a Bitcoin. It's called a Satoshi. So it goes down 8 decimal places, whereas a dollar only goes down 2 decimal places. All you need to know is that Bitcoin is scarce. It's just like gold, except it's digital. And it will preserve your money because people can't create more of it, just like gold, where governments can't create more gold because they have to dig it out of the ground. Governments cannot create more Bitcoin. No one can create more Bitcoin. The code is what's actually releasing more of this currency into circulation. And that code cannot be hacked. No government, no company, no one can hack that code. No one has ever hacked that code. So it's a really strong network. The currency is scarce. It's fixed. So that means that governments can't devalue it. They can't impose inflation like they have now. And you will save your wealth as we go through what we're heading into for this World War type of event. That's really important because, again, what it's going to allow you to do is no matter where you are in the world during what's going to happen in the coming years, no matter where you are, no matter how crazy it's getting, you will at least have your money, have your wealth, and you can flee. And you can go somewhere else in the world where you're going to get treated better, and you have the ability to do that. If you don't start thinking about these things, you could be stuck in a situation where you're not able to flee, you're not able to get away and go where you're treated best because you have no money anymore because your wealth's been stolen from you through inflation, or you're just stuck in that system. The government has you stuck there. That country has you stuck there because you can't move anywhere. You can't afford to move anywhere. You can't go anywhere. But if you're preserving in an alternative form of money, just like this, you do have the ability to preserve your wealth and to grow more. And this is I don't talk too much about price charts with Bitcoin. This is a long-term price chart. So it shows you from 2010 until today, mid-2021. On the x-axis, the y-axis is price in dollars. And you can see over the long term, if you've saved in Bitcoin, you've made money. You've done really well. People look at too much of the short-term price actions with Bitcoin. You don't want to do that. When in doubt, zoom out. That's a saying. When in doubt, zoom out. Buy, hold, save. This is real money, and this helps lead people to individual prosperity and freedoms. So really important stuff. All right. So that was a little long-winded here. I went a little bit farther than I probably should have, but really important topics. I wanted to display it in this way in a presentation because it's really hard to explain to people or to try to put into words what I'm seeing happening today. What's happening today has happened before, and it always happens. There's cycles in history. Everything that has actually happened in the world throughout history, for one reason or another, has been cycles. And if you can just follow and understand those cycles, you can understand where we are in this point of history, and it will make more sense to you. So you won't get caught up in the noise. You won't get caught up on whatever the news is telling you. You need to understand that all these people have their own motives and their own objectives. But if you can understand what's happening in the world today, and you can look back on history to see what happened then, you can understand why it's happening today. And then that will give you more comfort because you know what's going on, you know why it's happening, and it will help you plan for the future. And, I believe that to answer the question, I believe we are entering another world war. I think this war is going to look different, and I think we're in it right now. I think we're just starting it. This war looks different than it has in the past because of technology. Where we exist right now, there's a very small group of people that have the ability to control and influence a lot of people based off of technology, right? Based off of whatever you're looking at on social media. They can influence and nudge you and mess with your emotions and change the way you're thinking. We're seeing a very different war now, and it's a global war. In the United States, our news networks never will show us what has been happening all around the world. But the truth is, for the last 10 years, there have been massive protests in every country in the world, all over the same issues. The wealth gap chart that I showed you from the United States is the same one in every other country. It's the fight of the bottom 90% against the top 0.1%. This is the fight that we're seeing happening today. This is the fight that's going on. And I believe that we are entering another world war. Now, whether that's going to be with China or not, I cannot give that. I cannot give my opinion now. Clearly, there are tensions. I'm hoping that what happens is that these politicians don't lead us into a hot war with China, because, there's a saying, when all else fails, they bring you to war, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen. But I think that this war looks different. I think that it's a combined effort against, just not just one country, multiple countries, to impose restrictions and controls on the people in a unified fashion to control through that way. So, with that being said, doom and gloom, is it? It may or may not be. I don't even think, when people will ask me that, oh, well, don't you think it's doom and gloom? Not really, because it's just the truth. And if it's the truth and it's the objective, if you're looking at the objective facts of what's going on, I don't really have an emotional tie to that. It's just what's going on. You tell me if it's depressing or anything. But what I can tell you is that I know how to plan, and that's what I'm trying to do here with the audience, is trying to help you plan. So no, it's not doom and gloom. Through these periods that we're going through right now in history, even though the currency is doing what it's doing, there's the ability to build generational wealth. There's a lot of opportunities in these periods of history. So it is still an amazing time to be alive. It is an incredible time to be alive. Don't ever for a second think that, this is a horrible time to be alive. It's an incredible time to be alive. We have so many tools available to us through the internet that people never had in their lives. You could start a company now for almost no cost from the internet and have employees from anywhere around the world. So I believe that this is a very empowering time. And I do believe that Bitcoin is the road bump to this type of global cycle of wars and world powers and stuff. I really do think that Bitcoin, will probably save us from going into some type of hot war, to be honest with you. But with that being said, I provided a little context into where I think we are today, why people are acting the way they are, provided some context into why I think governments are the way they are right now, where we're going towards this more authoritative, communist, fascist type of control, technocratic control, and how to avoid that and get on the life raft, as we like to say in Bitcoin. But that's it, y'all. I hope you really enjoyed it. I know this was a little bit longer, but I think it's valuable. I'm happy that it's going to be sitting on the channel. But if you liked what you saw, definitely share this video with a loved one. Share this video with a family friend. Share this video with someone who is trying to learn a little bit more about economics and finance and maybe history. You would help them, and that would also help me. But that's going to be it today, y'all. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much. Love each other, and I'll see you in the next video.